Today I'm going to discuss my research on the urban history of Xi'an. Xi'an, as you all may know, was once known as Chang'an, a longtime capital of Chinese dynasties, and this included the Qin, Han, and the Tang. Nowadays, any mention of Xi'an makes people think of its most famous tourist attraction, the first emperor's Terracotta army. Of course, the tourist industry is heavily invested in drawing attention to Xi'an's significance as an ancient capital. We can also say that local pride, of course, the real estate industry, transportation, local officials, they're all invested in this image as well. Not surprisingly, most of the English language scholarship out there on Xi'an has really focused on its place in early and medieval China. By contrast, Xi'an seems to fall largely out of the story of modern China. The history of modern China is often told from the perspective of centers of political and economic power, especially Beijing and Shanghai. The sheer amount of scholarship that focuses on Shanghai and Beijing has this effect of suggesting that the experiences of these first-tier cities unfold nationally and they're reproduced in other places. However, the literature on uneven development, both within and outside of the field, that is the China field, and scholarship on China's interior regions, especially non-Han regions, it shows that we cannot simply take Beijing and Shanghai as models for the rest of the nation. So when I began my research on the urban history of modern Xi'an 10 years ago, I quickly realized that the city had been the focus of state investment in modern times as the so-called gateway to the Northwest. So here's a list of development programs that were undertaken in the name of correcting regional inequality, and that's regional inequality between coastal and inland China. So I'm not sure what it's like in Turkey, but in China, its leaders often spoke of redistribution. So regardless of where they were along the political spectrum, whether to the left or the right. They presented each of these efforts as this major national event, one that would help realize national unity and sometimes socialist equality as well. Territorial fragmentation in modern China was often understood as resulting from imperialism, a lack of national consciousness, a weak central government, and you also have radical thinkers that politicize geographical unevenness as part of their critiques of capitalism. There is, of course, also the matter of China's territorial claims. So state leaders, they often worried that regions that fell behind would also fall outside of their control. They worried that economic inequality would lead to political separatism in non-Han areas. Xi'an is located in the middle of the country. I'll just go back to this map here. But it is on the edge of China proper. The city is home to a small but prominent Hui Muslim community as well. So it's often categorized with non-Han regions in these state campaigns. And like non-Han regions, the modern history of Xi'an has often been recounted through the framework of central benevolence and local gratitude. So this idea that's been coined by Emily, that central leaders are presenting the gift of development to these regions that are expected to reciprocate with gratitude. And so in this talk, I'm going to move beyond the narration of local history according to this continuous unfolding of benevolent state action. Instead, I'm going to turn to a different form of temporality, and that's namely crisis. So when we look at the history of Xi'an over the past century, we'll notice that these moments of state activity all took place in times of economic and territorial crises. And so these were crises that threatened China's eastern seaboard largely. So repetition of crisis compelled central officials in these moments to rethink political economy. They politicized regional inequality, and then they identified surpluses. So surpluses of industry, population, and investment that had to be relocated to the interior. So Xi'an has been one of these major targets during these great acts of what some scholars would call deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So crisis is not the exception, but the rule of its modern development. So in recent years, many scholars and writers have cautioned us not to take the word crisis for granted. Of course, we have a proliferation of crises in recent years, one that we're still living through as well. So environmental, economic, political, health. And many writers and scholars have pointed out how the notion of crisis has been instrumentalized for various agendas. And so we really have to pay attention to the discursive framing of crisis. And so I'm going to discuss the important place of political ideology and also cultural imaginaries in these programs of interregional distribution. I'm going to attend to how they steered national desire westward, and then how they also remade local space and society, remaking them in ways that defy this linear narrative of development. So let me start with Xi'an in the early 20th century, just to defamiliarize ourselves with this image of the Silk Road that's so prevalent these days. So in the early modern period, Xi'an had served as a key military stronghold for the Qing dynasty. It was home to the largest garrison, that is the Manchu garrison, outside of the capital of Beijing. So the city had this strategic location along supply routes that allowed the Qing state to expand westward all the way to Altushar, now part of Xinjiang. So much of Xi'an took the form of a military encampment as a result. So military households, known as the Eight Banners, they lived exclusively in this walled settlement in the northeastern corner of the Manchu city. Also present in the city were the prestigious Neo-Confucian Guanzhong Academy. You have the Hui Muslim community's long-standing Great Mosque, and then you also have the Guangren Tibetan Buddhist Lamasery. So together, these presented a multicultural landscape that demonstrated that the Qing had universal authority over different ethnic subjects. The significance of Xi'an to the Qing state would, however, prove to be a liability to local people during the 1911 revolution. And so Han nationalists at that time, they burned the Manchu quarter to the ground, and they also massacred tens of thousands of its occupants. And this drastically changed the ethnic composition of the city, changing from triangulation of Han, Manchu, and Hui to primarily Han and Hui. And of course, it also changed the built environment of the city as well. So afterwards, you have Xi'an falling outside of the orbit of the central government. The city became this battleground for warlords that were vying for power. And so in 1926, you have a warlord, Liu Zhenhua, who laid siege to the city for 8 months. Soon afterwards, the surrounding region was also hit by a severe famine that lasted from 1928 to 1931. And so the siege had already exhausted grain reserves in the city, and so you had mass starvation that followed. And it's because of this that the region became evidence for both domestic and foreign observers to present China as this land of famine. So when we think about China as a land of famine in the early 20th century, it's often using evidence from this region. So eventually you have the Kuomintang taking power in this region. They defeated regional warlord Feng Yuxiang, and then started to expand their influence in the region. And so under the Kuomintang, Xi'an would soon gain a national audience. It was presented to them as a stepping stone to reach resources in the interior and also a beacon of past glory. So I'll explain that in this section. So in the 1930s, you have the effects of the Great Depression being felt in China. And the Kuomintang joined nations around the world in starting this new era of economic planning. And they also pursued autarky. So their economic plans drew heavily on the ideas of their late leader, Sun Yat-sen. Before his death, Sun called for the building of transcontinental railroads in China. And these would branch out from ports along the eastern seaboard, and they would open up so-called virgin land. This is a direct translation from the American context, of course. And open up this virgin land in Northwest China. So Sun drew on the American frontier story. He believed that opening up rich frontier regions would rescue his nation from poverty and backwardness. And so at the time, Sun's plans fell on deaf ears, but the idea gained popularity 10 years later when frontier expansion appeared to the Kuomintang the best way for the country to overcome the effects of the Great Depression, undertake import substitution, and then realize a self-sufficient national economy. So the effects of the Great Depression then served as the point of departure, not only for Japanese military expansion into Manchuria, northeast China, but also Kuomintang plans to open up northwest China. And so these were both efforts that were launched in search of a so-called lifeline during economic crisis. So Kuomintang officials, they devoted much of their civilian budget in the 1930s to Northwest projects, especially in the province of Shanxi. This is the province that Xi'an is located in. And so the National Economic Council, they connected Xi'an to the coast via the Longhai Railroad. And they also expanded cotton production in the region so that they could supply textile mills in Shanghai. So at the same time, you have right-wing thinkers in the Kuomintang also seizing on this moment of economic restructuring to address their own concerns. And namely, they thought that China was suffering from a spiritual crisis. They felt very alienated by life in treaty ports with foreign settlements such as Shanghai. One of the leaders of the right-wing faction within the Kuomintang is Dai Jitao, the president of the examination yuan. I'm drawing a lot on his writings actually in this section. And so right-wing thinkers like Dai Jitao were alienated by treaty ports with foreign settlements like Shanghai. They linked these imperialist spaces with what they saw as materialist decadence. And then they also attributed imperialist spaces to the rise of radical politics like communism as well. And so right-wingers, they started to imagine a seemingly pure and uncorrupted place, one that was free from foreign influence. They drew on the history of past dynasties based inland and claimed that the nation had forsaken its old home in the Northwest. For a national revival, it needed to head to the Northwest and rediscover the golden ages of Chinese civilization. So you have calls to head to the Northwest, open up the Northwest, extending beyond right-wing circles to be featured regularly in the mass media. And so for this sense of loss and nostalgia that right-wing thinkers had, Xi'an was perfectly positioned with abundant symbols of the past. And so in 1932, the Kuomintang created a secondary capital in Xi'an and renamed the city Xijing, or Western Capital. The central government assigned Zhang Qi, a veteran revolutionary, to oversee its planning and development. So when looking for exemplars of national spirit, Zhang pointed to Italy and Germany, the two countries that he believed in the 1930s was the most like China in the world. So the secret to Mussolini's power, he observed, was his ability to arouse the Italian masses by appealing to the spirit of ancient Rome. Likewise, he believed that the philosopher Fichte rekindled the innate spirit of Germania. And so Zhang called on Chinese patriots to head to Xi'an, regain their cultural self-confidence, and effect a national revival. So for right-wing thinkers, what was embarrassing about the modern state of China was not simply that it was worse off than the West, but that it couldn't even compare to its own past. The Kuomintang's image of this pure and uncorrupted homeland really seemed to have little grounding in reality. And so by the time the party asserted its authority over the region, it certainly found victims of famine and war. But to its surprise, they also found modern girls walking hand in hand with dandies on the streets. These moderns were gallivanting around the city, creating scandals that were being reported in local newspapers. So far from being isolated, Xi'an locals are actually participating in a global circulation of commodities and media images. They embrace the same material objects and fashion themselves after the same cultural reference as their more obvious cosmopolitan counterparts in Shanghai. These moderns watched movies featuring Charlie Chaplin, Emil Jannings, Cary Grant, Rin Tin Tin. They went to department stores to shop for cheapao, high heels, Western suits, leather shoes, et cetera, et cetera. When conservative officials encountered the same urban decadence that had propelled them to this faraway region, they started to steer local identity away from mass culture and towards an ancient homeland. And so in local newspapers, the Kuomintang presented locals as honest, simple, frugal, and diligent citizens for the rest of the nation to emulate. While planning the city, officials prioritize the gaze of the visitor that's looking for a collective past. They took great pains to introduce garden city planning at this time. They introduced functional zoning so that you could balance out the material with the spiritual realm. And so demarcating historic zones and making sure that they were able to balance out industrial zones. They also cracked down on potential eyesores, and these included refugee settlements in the city. To raise the profile of their Western capital further, the central government proposed National Tomb Sweeping Day. In their vision, they saw patriots paying homage not to their own ancestors, but to past emperors, generals, and ministers that were buried nearby. There are a few ironies in the story, of course. We know that the Northwest became home not to a conservative revolution, but a communist one. So Xi'an served as a base from which the Kuomintang launched military campaigns against the Communist Party that was based in northern Shanxi and Henan. So in spite of pouring great financial and military resources into this region, it remained on the edges of Kuomintang control. And you have the famous Xi'an incident occurring in December 1936. So China's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, was visiting the city to see what progress had been made in communist pacification. And it's at that time that he's kidnapped by his own generals. So after being taken at night, Chiang was forced into a second united front with the communists against further Japanese encroachment. During the war, you have right-wing visions of patriots heading to the frontier, materializing instead in the form of refugees. So refugees that are fleeing from environmental disaster in neighboring Henan province. So it's at this time that you have the Kuomintang breaking the dikes of the Yellow River. This was a tactical strategy to hold off the Japanese advance. And instead, it sent hundreds of thousands of refugees heading inland, further inland, to Xi'an by following the Longhai Railroad. And eventually, they gathered in a shanty town outside of the railroad station. The local population increases dramatically in the 1930s and 1940s. So from 100,000 in the 1930s to 400,000 by the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and then 800,000 during the Chinese Civil War. So after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, you have a much stronger state, of course, and the Chinese Communist Party would transform Xi'an into precisely what the conservatives had dreaded, a modern industrial city. So communist officials stationed in the Northwest, this included Xi Zhongxun, current leader Xi Jinping's father. These officials felt that they had inherited a region that was terribly underdeveloped. And so like many other cities, Xi'an had suffered from over a decade of wartime destruction. This included air raids by the Japanese military. It also included Kuomintang destruction of factories upon their retreat. So besides the need for post-war reconstruction, party leaders also observed that cotton and wool that was being produced in the region was still being shipped all the way to coastal cities like Shanghai and Tianjin in order to be woven. So the Chinese Communist Party argued at this time that building industrial complexes in the interior was necessary to curb interregional extraction, and it was also necessary to curb waste, in this case, waste of fuel for shipments to and from the coast. And so communist delegates in the Northwest, they argued early on that a portion of Shanghai's machinery had to be shipped inland. But party leaders eventually went further to transfer people, people from the coast and Manchuria, when the Northwest still seemed short of labor power and technical skill. And so this all occurs during the first five-year plan from 1953 to 1957. And so the first five-year plan committed the majority of industrial investment in inland China. Drawing on Soviet experience, Zhou and Lai argued that Northwest China, in spite of its supposed backwardness, had conditions that were comparable to Magnitogorsk in the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. So there, the Soviet Union had demonstrated its own experience with industrializing peripheries. It built a gigantic steel plant on the steppe that could best any in the capitalist world. At the same time, you have in the 1950s a continuous succession of Cold War conflicts in East Asia. So you have the Korean War that's followed by the first Indochina War, and then the first Taiwan Strait crisis as well. And so these all made industrial centers along the coast appear very vulnerable to military attack. And so consequently, Xi'an became home to 17 of 156 Soviet-sponsored industrial projects. So you have factories that were developed in the city dedicated to cotton textile production, electrical equipment, machines, and they were all built in designated zones. And so this is one of the districts, the newly built districts in the 1950s called Textile Town. This is one of the interiors of the factory, so you just have a sense of this socialist monumentality that they're producing at that time. You also have in the south a cultural and educational district that's established. So the state council decided to relocate universities inland as well. And this included one of China's leading universities of science and technology, Jiaotong University. And so the idea here was that you not only need to develop the economic base, but you also need to supply the superstructure as well to develop the base. And so in 1956 alone, you have 80,000 people that go to Xi'an. And newspaper articles, visual images, memoirs, they all paint these romantic images of socialist cooperation. And this was socialist cooperation in not just its national form, but also, of course, its internationalist form as well. So Xi'an became the space of socialist encounter. It was a place where Soviet and East German advisors, Shanghai textile workers, Beijing cadres, Northeast technicians, and others, they all came together and they achieved a sense of camaraderie through their labor. And so this was not an easy process, of course. So coastal subjects, they experienced a lot of challenges when giving up the comforts of home. Their sacrifice, though, was often recounted in the official press and then in later memoirs as their commitment to socialist industrialization. So relocation to Xi'an was no trivial matter. It meant that recruits would have to permanently give up their household registration, their registration that entitled them to live and receive benefits in Shanghai. So upon their arrival, work and living conditions were often much worse than they were told in Shanghai. There were shortages of mechanical equipment. Housing was a long time problem in the city with this influx of workers and students. It was said, though, that so long as new arrivals were committed to working with local comrades, then these inconveniences would simply be temporary, and they would be able to recreate their former lives in the Northwest. So here we see this temporal disjuncture for these uprooted coastal subjects, this disjuncture between this promise of socialist futurity and the sense of going back in time. Of course, what would be bridged, the way of bridging this was through their own labor and their own temperance. By contrast, those that were recruited from nearby counties are simply described in newspapers and memoirs as hardworking, honest, genuine subjects that were just ready for productive labor. So there were also tens of thousands of rural migrants that moved into the city in the 1950s for contract work on construction sites at that time as well. So these are just a sense of like some of the divisions within local society in the socialist period. It soon became clear towards the end of the first 5-year plan that this rapid industrialization came at a heavy cost. So city planning came under national scrutiny in the spring of 1957. It's at that time that international affairs seemed less tense. So you have the end of the first Taiwan Strait crisis. You also have the Bandung Conference that had just occurred. And so there was Mao Zedong starting to signal that there needed to be a bit of a change in the national approach to industrial development. And so in his speech on the 10 major relationships, Mao affirmed the need for industrialization in the interior, but he also called for more attention to existing coastal bases. And so this sparked a debate within the academic community at Jiaotong University. So many people argued that it was detrimental for the university to break off its connections in Shanghai and move to a place that was only in the beginning stages of industrial development. And so for these critics, they started to say that the economic base should precede the superstructure. The superstructure should not precede the development of this industrial economic base. For critics, it also seemed like an unprecedented move in world history. And so they pointed out how neither Moscow University or Bauman University in the Soviet Union had relocated for Magnitogorsk. You also have an inspection that's undertaken by the State Council members Li Fuchun and Bo Eibo. And this revealed discontent amongst peasants at that time. So Li and Bo, they criticized how planners became out of touch with the masses because they were so mesmerized by Soviet aesthetics. So the city quickly expanded into neighboring villages in the 1950s, so expanding far beyond the walled city. The walled city is outlined here in green and blue. And its population quickly doubled to 1.4 million. And so you have vast tracts of farmland requisitioned for state projects. But these reports showed how there was too much land that was being taken during requisition, and it was often taken long before it was actually needed. And so factories were found to be only occupying a fraction of the land that was taken, and the rest was comprising green belts, also space that was dedicated for future growth. And at a time in which waste was heavily politicized in China, they also observed how, this formerly agricultural land was going out of cultivation because of idleness after requisition. So this productive land that was becoming unproductive and merely aesthetic. So agricultural communities, they complained also about the process of requisition. They said that state functionaries intimidated them, threatened them with violence, encroached on their land, and then because they were single-mindedly focused on fulfilling their deadlines, they would even uproot fields of wheat in order to complete their tasks. And so the sprawling city became a cautionary tale of how the socialist standards of Soviet planning were too ostentatious in China. And then density became the order of the day in urbanization. So from this problem of regional inequality, you see in the early 1950s the production of a problem of urban-rural relations out of it. And so it really draws our attention to the ways in which we have to pay attention to the scale of the regional scales as one of a number of nested scales and be mindful of the ways in which it can also map onto and further exacerbate the urban-rural divide within China. After the Sino-Soviet split, the Chinese Communist Party would relocate more factories and populations from the coast in the 1960s and 70s. And these were part of what's known as the Third Front projects. As a result of these years of redistribution and urbanization, Northwest China would have some of the highest rates of urbanization in the country by the start of reforms. So from a Maoist industrial center, Xi'an would eventually be recast using the Silk Road imaginary. This term Silk Road, of course, originally was coined by Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, and this was following his geological surveys of inland China. He was identifying possible sites of resource extraction. Richthofen's work became this classic point of reference for Chinese geologists. But aside from them, the term Silk Road actually circulated much more frequently outside of China for much of its existence. It was linked within China to colonial explorers and plunderers of Chinese antiquities. And this included Sven Hedin, Orlstein, Otani Kozue. This all began to change in the 1970s. And so you have these ideological divides in the socialist world that coincide with the crisis of crises in the capitalist world as well. And so China started to engage the capitalist world at that time. But even then, the People's Daily had to run this article in the form of question and answer to explain to its readers what the Silk Road was and what all this fuss was. So explain that China was once known to Westerners as Ceres, Eastern Silk Country, and how unnamed Western historians have called the northern and southern trading routes stemming from the Han Empire to Central Asia, and those that carried silk from Persia to the Roman Empire, the Silk Road. And so as Deng Xiaoping assumed power at the end of 1978, you have some cultural production that starts to occur on the Silk Road. And this includes, of course, the Japanese NHK and Chinese CCTV co-produced documentary series, The Silk Road. And so Xi'an appears in the first episode called Glories of Ancient Chang'an. And so this shows how, it appears that it's China's newfound relationship with Japan that's one of the significant driving forces behind the rise of the Silk Road imaginary. And you have, this follows the restoration of diplomatic relations in the early 1970s. And so within this episode, Glories of Ancient Chang'an, the city of Xi'an is described as this starting point to the world's last unexplored region. And so as China was only beginning to embark on its open door policy, the producers presented themselves as explorers. The voiceover repeatedly emphasizes that they were the first television crews allowed access to certain sites, particularly the Terracotta Army. So the film crews were also able to travel to the tomb of Zhang Xian, the Han Dynasty envoy, who's typically credited with forging the Silk Road. And then the introduction also culminates in shots of burial mounds of Tang emperors. So for Japanese audiences, of course, this is very significant because of the relationship with Tang Dynasty, Chang'an, that was considered the origin of Japanese-Chinese relations. So soon after diplomatic relations were established, also you have the cities of Nara and Kyoto becoming friendship cities with Xi'an. So the Silk Road documentary actually asserts this very different idea of cosmopolitanism than the socialist world making that we see in 1950s Xi'an. So in one scene, you have a presentation of socialist street life. So you have green-clad PLA soldiers riding the streets, crossing paths with blue-clad workers. And it's at this point that the voiceover asks, what's left of ancient Chang'an and its cosmopolitanism. And so the documentary searches, it points to objects with Western origins like watermelons, pomegranates, cucumbers, walnuts, sesame, polo that's being played as well. You also have religion, of course, forging a new world for post-socialist subjects. So you have a discussion of Islam in one scene that brings together new friends from China, Japan, Algeria, Syria. And in another, you have a Buddhist monk showing a Japanese reporter his stash of Sanskrit sutras. So this appeal of the Silk Road was not lost on Xi'an officials. They tried to use this romantic image of the shared history between West and East to their economic advantage. And this all occurs at a time in which they're struggling with material displacement. So in the Reform era, income and economic growth in Xi'an starts to fall behind other regions. So the central government starts to reduce fiscal transfers from the coast. It ends programs of redistribution, and then it really focuses preferential policies on special economic zones along the coast. You also have the growth of ecology as a field in this period. And that leads the State Council to advise local officials in Xi'an to avoid polluting industries. So polluting industries that had been inherited from the Mao era that were taking a toll on the local environment. And so they encouraged the city instead to focus on tourism. And so the national economy is now conceived in terms of regional comparative advantage instead of local self-sufficiency. And so city officials, they start to cultivate this so-called image of an ancient capital. And they do so with a lot of the archaeological discoveries of the Mao era. And so It's in the Mao era that you have, of course, all this industrialization that I was describing, this urban expansion. But while all of that is proceeding, there's also all these archaeological sites that are being discovered at the same time. And so archaeologists of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, they start to survey the landscape whenever there are these new discoveries, and they conduct excavation as well. They conduct research into sites like the Banpo Neolithic village that was discovered while they were building the textile city that I showed in the earlier slide. There's also Daming Palace, a royal palace of the Tang Dynasty. There's Qinglong Temple, where the Japanese monk Kukai studied. And then there's also the first emperor Qin Shi Huang's terracotta army, of course. So from these monumental factories that were supposed to represent socialist futurity in the Mao era, officials in the Reform era, they started to reorder the urban fabric around these archaeological discoveries instead. And so these archaeological sites, they were no longer considered simply this dead labor from past ages. In the Mao era, they were also considered evidence of friendship between nations before modern day imperialism divided them. But now these sites served as this as the grounds for new forms of exchange and intimacy between the post-socialist and capitalist worlds. So you have foreign dignitaries that begin traveling to Xi'an, and they travel especially to the Terracotta Army for photo ops. So for instance, you have, the Mr. Neoliberal Economics, Ronald Reagan here. And then you also have the Clintons, I guess no less neoliberal as well here as well. And so you also have Japanese tourists that flock to Qinglong Monastery, and it's Japanese delegations in the 1980s that start to suggest the building of a memorial stele and a memorial hall dedicated to the monk Kukai and his teacher Hui Guo in this time. You also have Chinese Muslims taking part. Sorry, did my screen stop sharing?
Yes, you have to turn it on again.
Okay,
I think that somehow your PowerPoint disappeared. Yeah, you're back again.
Okay.
These are great photos, by the way.
Yes, thank you. So okay, so that's oh sorry. Let me go back. So this is Kukai. This is the rebuilt site of Qinglong Monastery. You have the Muslim quarter in Xi'an that becomes an attraction as well. This is at a time when Muslims in China start to take part in Hajj, and they negotiate their national and religious identities. And so the growth of international visitors to this city convinced the national tourism industry to feature the city prominently on its most popular itinerary for foreigners. And so if you went to China in the 1980s, 1990s, you probably do this route. So Beijing, Xi'an, Shanghai. And so soon commentators, they remarked that if you come to China and you don't go to Xi'an, then you haven't really been to China. So you have lots of farmers in the surrounding suburbs. This is at a time in which they're deemed underemployed. They start to abandon agricultural work. This is also a time of decollectivization, and they start to engage in the service sector. And so this local emphasis on the commercial tourism soon produced its own problems. You have newspapers that discussed how locals felt a lot of resentment towards foreign tourists because they received preferential treatment at different sites. You also have local tour guides taking kickbacks and commissions from factory, shop, and restaurant owners. You have the provincial government discovering how businesses were also illegally selling historic artifacts. Tourists also seem to be falling victim to rampant pickpocketing as well, especially on public transportation. And then you have a lot of complaints by locals about noise pollution because of the construction of hotels and other sites for tourists at that time. It often seemed within state media that locals were to blame for the problems of the market reforms. So even as officials at this time are building this like monument to Chinese civilization, talking about this ancient form of cosmopolitanism that's supposed to be evidence in the built environment. They often blame locals for being insufficiently civilized and also insufficiently cosmopolitan in order to foster the kind of local economic growth that they would like to see. And so reform era officials, they began to advocate for locals, as in many other cities, to embrace spiritual civilization as a means of creating this favorable environment for foreign investment. And so the residents of Xi'an eventually found themselves at the forefront of yet another developmental campaign. Starting in the late 1980s, you have a lot of leaders in inland provinces starting to criticize the central government for its uneven regional development policy. Prioritizing coastal regions to the detriment of inland regions. In 2000, you have leader Jiang Zemin announcing the Open Up the West campaign from Xi'an. This was a campaign that was launched after the Asian financial crisis, also preceding China's entry into the WTO. And it was launched to offset the economic advantages that had been enjoyed by coastal regions for the first 2 decades of reform. So central authorities, they broadly defined this backward region that was being targeted for investment. And this would eventually encompass the entire western half of China. So the Open Up the West campaign, it affected massive urbanization within the region. And so earlier regimes, they had really limited the scale of cities, but development projects, the expansion of urban borders, these all became central to local government revenue at this time. And so local governments were really invested in expanding their borders as a means of generating revenue through land rents. So in 2010, for instance, you have the provincial government passing a resolution to integrate the city of Xi'an with the neighboring city of Shenyang. This is where the airport is, into what they call this internationalized metropolis. And this would eventually be planned to have a population of 10 million and a surface area of 800 square kilometers. So urban growth and renewal has also bolstered the traditional city image that officials have been crafting for Silk Road tourism. And so in 2005, officials passed this plan to revive the Tang imperial capital. So local government officials, they inaugurated the strategy with this 1.3 billion yuan theme park, Tang Paradise. This is located south of the walled city. It was supposed to give visitors this taste of Tang Dynasty poetry, music, dance, architecture. Since then, you also have the construction around the city of commercial, residential, public spaces, taking this Neo-Tang architectural style to maintain these aesthetic sensibilities. This is this World Horticultural Expo also that was hosted in Xi'an with the Chang'an Tower there. And then in 2010, officials opened up the much anticipated Daming Palace National Heritage Park. This was a park that was supposed to showcase the ruins of a Tang Dynasty royal palace and its rebuilt imperial gates. This is a project that was underwritten by China's 11th five-year plan. And so to construct this 3 square kilometer park, it required the tearing down of neighboring slums and relocation of over 100,000 residents. And so officials, they celebrated how they transformed what had been this poor and crime-infested area into this monument of Chinese civilization. In the process, of course, they increased property values in an area that's now inhabited by high-rise developments. So considering how the Silk Road has played this vital part in economic development in the interior, it shouldn't be surprising, of course, that China's current leader, Xi Jinping, who calls the province of Shanxi home, would eventually summon the Silk Road as the key word for China's overseas ambitions. And so Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy is the latest instance of Chinese state officials mobilizing the cultural imagination to reorient the nation at a time of crisis. And this time it's the issue of slow growth, this era of slow growth that China has entered in the 2010s. And so the New Silk Road draws on representational practices that have been developed in peripheries that struggled with uneven development in the early reform era, peripheries that sought to draw in foreign tourists and their spending power to the hinterland. But nowadays, the Silk Road seems to be de-linked from these locales, and it's used instead as a metaphor for a new era of logistics and supply chain capitalism. So in this talk, I've been trying to historicize the Silk Road as just one of a series of ways that people have imagined the city of Xi'an over the 20th century. So from a Qing military stronghold, the city was successfully presented to a national audience as a place of famine, a national homeland, a beacon of socialist industrialization, and now an ancient world of cosmopolitanism. All these shifts, as I argue, occurred in moments of crisis when Chinese leaders appealed to national spirit, socialist cooperation and industrialization, and newfound global connections. So contrary to developmentalist narratives that assume the singular linear path of developmental progress, these frames of crisis reveal shifting orders of value production that shape national desire, as well as experiences on the ground in Xi'an. So that's it. I welcome any questions that you may have, points of clarification, suggestions, alternative interpretations, or even stories of Xi'an that you'd like to discuss. So thank you very much.